Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this session on Can Carbon Leakage Hinder Transition to a Green Economy? My name is Erinc Yeldan. I am a professor of economics at Kadir Has University in Istanbul. And today, Maksym Chepeliev from the Center for Global Trade Analysis will be hosting, recording, and aiding us for today's session. And he will help us ensure that we'll be taking along the time in a proper order. Now, before getting the presentations, please allow me to remind the rules of the game here. First of all, we kindly request that all attendees, except the person currently speaking, of course, must remain muted. Unless otherwise noted, presentations will last 20 minutes. The session host will verbally prompt the presenter, it is Maksym, when there are 2 minutes remaining of their allotted time, and when the presentation time has elapsed, even if the presentation has not ended, the host will prompt again, and I will have to immediately move on to the discussion period. Discussion will last 10 minutes for each presenter. We prefer that you enter your questions, comments, suggestions to enter into the chat. However, we have an affordable number of participants. By the way, welcome all. They can raise their hands through the screen, and I will give them the floor in due order. There will be a 2-minute transition in between presenters. And in between the time, I will be introducing, wrapping up the whole session, and giving the floor to our presenters. Okay, can carbon leakage hinder transition to a green economy? This is our topic today. We have 3 presenters, and in order to save us on time, please let me go ahead and allow me to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Julio Fournier from Union Institute. Dr. Fournier holds a PhD from Humboldt University of Berlin, and he will be presenting his paper on potential carbon leakage risk, a cross-sector, cross-country assessment in the OECD area. Julio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Erinc. Let me share my screen. So hopefully you can see my slides now. Yeah, okay. So thanks for being there today and on your interest in our presentation entitled Potential Carbon Leakage Risk Across Sector, Cross Country Assessment in the OECD area, which is joint work with my colleague Florian Freund at the Thünen Institute of Market Analysis. So let me begin with something that probably most of you know, that nowadays there's like more than 130 countries which have planned or have pledged to achieve climate neutrality in the near future. Achieving climate targets requires more stringent climate mitigation policies, including the participation of all sectors. And this is because of cost efficiency things and several other factors. However, in a fragmented global climate regime, which is the world we are living in, unilateral mitigation policies affecting sectors' production costs increase carbon leakage risk. I assume that most of you already know what carbon leakage is. If not, then let me just briefly tell you that's a spillover effect that happens when domestic or unilateral climate policies actually do not only reduce emissions domestically, but also unintendedly increase greenhouse gas emissions in third countries. And of course, this is bad. This is a lose-lose situation because at the end, we could end at a situation where we achieve fewer, even negative greenhouse gas emission savings at a potentially high economic cost. Carbon leakage risk also happens in downstream sectors, and this happens via production inputs, which are more expensive due to carbon costs in other sectors. And of course, carbon leakage risk, or carbon leakage, sorry, is considered a major barrier to sectors' acceptance of more stringent climate policy. That's why it's so important to actually assess this risk to actually not hinder a transition to a green economy, because we need the efforts and the contribution of every sector. Sectoral carbon leakage risk assessments. So we have mainly three ways to assess leakage risk. The first way is ex post type of analysis, econometric analysis. The problem with this type of study is that it's limited by the lack of experience. So actually, climate policies around the world have excluded several sectors systematically, and so we don't have the data, we don't have the experience to measure carbon leakage in these sectors. The second way to estimate carbon leakage risk is ex ante, is with economic models, and these models range from partial to general equilibrium. So we already have several presentations on this in this GTAP conference. And there's a third way to assess carbon leakage risk ex ante, actually with the help of the IDE metric, which stands for emission intensity and trace exposure metric, which is actually the official approach to identify vulnerable sectors to carbon leakage, used by most carbon jurisdictions around the world, including the European Emission Trading System, or EU ETS. However, while most studies in the literature report economy-wide carbon leakage rate, so this does not let us actually see the risk for each sector, sector-level assessments typically focus on energy-intensive sectors, which are actually the sectors which have been subject to climate policy in the past. So that's actually, this is very important, but it does not let what is the implied carbon leakage risk for other sectors which are non-energy intensive. Furthermore, because studies focus on the effects of particular climate policies on particular units in, for instance, sectors in particular countries, it is challenging to compare results across studies, because climate policies, the simulation will have different designs, different prices, carbon prices, different sectors, different countries. So it's very hard to compare results. So our study uses the IDE metric to estimate potential carbon leakage risk in all sectors in all OECD countries under three different but comparable climate policy scenarios, which I'm going to introduce in a minute. The main findings of our study are that potential carbon leakage risk in downstream sector could be as high as in directly targeted sectors. Follow plus and transport sectors, Follow plus include actually agri-food sectors and forestry sectors, have on average a higher potential carbon leakage risk than energy-intensive sectors, which have been traditionally considered vulnerable to carbon leakage. And we also find a very high risk variability across OECD countries. So let me begin introducing the IDE metric that we use in this study. So the IDE metric is based on two components. The first one is sector's emission intensity, which is a proxy for relative carbon cost impact of a sector, right? So this is calculated for each sector and each country as direct emission plus indirect emissions times the carbon price divided by gross value added. We choose gross value added based on the suggestion by Sado et al., who actually find that gross value added it's has a higher temporal stability, and because sectors have direct control over it. Anyway, there are other alternatives that might be used. And importantly, there are two implicit assumptions in this equation. The first one is that we consider that the carbon price is uniform for all sectors and countries. And actually, we do this because we want to compare risk across sectors and countries. And the second implicit assumption here is actually a full carbon cost pass-through rate of indirect emissions. And actually, this does not necessarily have to be the case. So this depends on the market structures and different other factors. There are different studies that study this. However, in case that we do not have a full carbon cost pass-through rate, and with this emission intensity indicator here will give an upper bound of the relative carbon cost impact. So the second component of the aegis metric is the sector's trade intensity, which is actually a proxy for the trade responsiveness. And actually this captures exactly this competitiveness channel of carbon leakage, under which actually domestic products get replaced by foreign products because they face more or higher carbon costs, right? So the trade exposure measure indicator is calculated at export plus imports divided by domestic production of the sector plus imports. And of course, please note that in this equation, we exclude intra-OECD trades as suggested by a paper by Marc and all, who actually compare the aegis metric against carbon leakage measure based on the interviews, and they find that actually a T component, including intra-OECD trades, does not correlate with carbon leakage risk. So they suggest excluding it. And the intuition is that since OECD countries are expected to have higher ambition, higher carbon prices, we would not really expect to have carbon leakage happening in OECD countries. So that's the intuition. And finally, so we actually use these two components together to construct the aegis metric. And actually, this also follows from several recommendations in the literature where authors suggest using both components simultaneously and not just one. And note that we also do not use any thresholds here for estimating or for identifying vulnerable sectors, which is actually the case in many carbon jurisdictions. And but because we don't really want to find a final list of vulnerable sectors, but we want to compare carbon leakage risk across sectors. So that's why we don't use a threshold. So to estimate indirect emissions, we use an environmentally extended multi-regional input-output model. And to give you, explain briefly how does this work, let me first define sectors' production greenhouse gas emissions. And these are, so sectors' total emissions equal direct emissions plus indirect emissions. I hope most of you know this distinction. Direct emissions are those happening at the establishment of the sector of the firm, and indirect emissions are actually those emissions which are embedded in the production inputs, right? This can be equivalently expressed in sort of input-output language as Rx equals Cx plus Mz, where X is a vector of output per sector, per country, and Z is a matrix of global intermediate demand from actually giving us the flows going from sector I in country O to sector J in country B. And R, C, and M are total direct and indirect emission coefficients, respectively. So how do we go about estimating indirect emissions here? We have two unknowns, actually, R and M. So for estimating this, we assume that MIO equals RGD. This is also the approach used by Herwich and Wood, paper 2018. And the idea of doing this is that, so we are assuming that each sector in each country produces a good with the same cradle-to-gate emissions, regardless of it enters intermediate or final demand. This is the assumption that we need to do to get this estimation of indirect emissions. So if we do this and we replace R and M by M hat and rearrange, we get our equation for indirect emissions, estimated indirect emissions, where as usual, I is an identity matrix, A is the coefficient matrix, and the inverse of I minus A is the Leontief inverse matrix in the system. So now let me jump to climate policy scenarios. We consider 3 different scenarios, and these scenarios vary. So they vary. These scenarios vary according to the climate policy scope, the domestic climate policy scope. So beginning with the first, that under the total scenario, we assume that domestic climate policies imply carbon costs on all domestic sectors' greenhouse gas emission. Doesn't matter if these are direct or indirect emission. This is like an extreme situation, of course. The second scenario, under the direct scenario, domestic climate policies imply carbon costs on domestic sectors' direct greenhouse gas emissions only. This could be the case, for instance, if a domestic carbon policy or domestic policy includes all domestic sectors into a carbon tax scheme covering direct emissions, for example. And in the indirect scenario, we assume that domestic climate policies imply carbon costs on domestic sectors' indirect greenhouse gas emissions. This is might be the case if several sectors in the economy already face carbon costs, and for instance, a domestic sector also introduces carbon border adjustment mechanisms, kind of adjustment at the border, such that at the end, most indirect emissions of sectors are have implied carbon costs on it. For the data, we use the GTAP multi-regional input-output database, which is based on GTAP 10A. It's cover 141 countries and 65 economic sectors for 2014. We use direct greenhouse gas emissions also from GTAP. So this is the GTAP CO2 and non-CO2 GTAP databases. Actually, we just use cradle-to-gate emissions. So we exclude consumption emissions because we are not interested in final footprints, but on the indirect emissions of sectors. And just important to know that these databases excludes land use and land use change emissions at the sectoral level. So this is why they are not included there. And we use a uniform benchmark carbon price of $30 per ton CO2 equivalent. And this is an arbitrary decision, but we just take this price because several other studies also use it. So we thought it's nice to have the same price to have better comparison options to other studies. So let me now jump to the results. In this slide, you can see an average emission intensity in the OECD area on the vertical axis versus average trade exposure in the OECD area on the horizontal axis. And this is the total scenario. So in this scenario, all greenhouse gas emissions of sectors are covered, so to say. So they bear carbon costs. And what you see there, the circles are the different GTAP sectors. We have, as said before, 64 sectors. And actually, to have a better impression of how different this can be, so we actually classified GTAP sectors according to 7 different sector groups, which are given by different colors in the plot. So they are also given on the right. So we have the Afolu Plus sector, which is actually agri-food sectors plus forestry. We have the buildings, energy sectors, industry sectors, material sectors, which are actually include the energy-intensive industries like chemicals or metals. We have services and transport. And actually, I won't go into detail into specific sectors here, but just know that, of course, probably energy, you can see that energy sectors are the most probably are the most vulnerable to carbon leakage, and this is I think natural because of the nature of these sectors. But more important is to compare, for instance, the Afolu Plus sectors, which are given in green, towards the materials and industry sectors, and you see that it seems that the Afolu Plus sectors have a bit higher average emission intensity, whereas average trade exposure is not so clear for these sectors. Sorry, the circles area is proportional to the cross-country variation given by standard deviation of the item metric in the OECD area. So we see also that, for instance, petroleum and crude, which is the most emission-intensive sector, actually has a very high variation across countries, and this is also the case for the other energy sectors.
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Yeah, perfect. So this is the top 10 sectors according to carbon leakage risk. And actually here we see which are the most vulnerable sectors according to each scenario. So we have total scenario on the left, direct scenario in the middle, and the indirect on the right. And here we mark with red, for instance, Afolu Plus sectors, which actually make this top 10 list. And in yellow, we have materials, which are typical energy-intensive sectors. So we see that depending on the scenario, we will have different results, but several Afolu and transport sectors are in this list. Of course, if we take the average over sectors, and so we work at the sector group level, we also see here that energy, it's in this plot we see the contribution of each EI component, it's direct, indirect, national, OECD or non-OECD, and the trade exposure component. And we see, for instance, I'm just gonna center now or focus on Afolu Plus and materials. We see that they're more or less similar in emission intensity. They're also very similar in the trade exposure component. However, we see that the affectation of indirect emissions is much higher for materials than for Afolu sectors. So in Afolu sectors, direct emissions are most important in the IE component. And this is the final slide here about the results. So here we see the cross-country variation in the OECD countries for each sector group. And just to give you an example, here we choose a comparison between Germany, Estonia, and Colombia. And we see, for instance, the green pointers of Afolu Plus, and we see that this might be 2 or 3 times bigger in Estonia, and whereas in Colombia, of course, you see that probably it's half of the carbon leakage risk metric than in Germany. So huge variation across countries. So conclusions, our results suggest that sectors traditionally excluded from climate policy could have a relatively high emission, high carbon leakage risk under all climate policy scenarios. We find that carbon leakage risk has a high cross-country variability, and actually this highlights the importance of developing anti-leakage mechanism, at least for the most vulnerable sector. And this is, of course, crucial to increase sectors' acceptance of more stringent climate policies. And as such, permit or allow a transition to a green economy and sort of climate neutrality in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Julio. Thank you for attending the time. Now the floor is open for comments and suggestions and observations from our audience. Matthias.
Thanks. I'm trying to unmute myself. Well, first an observation. You have motivated your choice of the indicator by many studies, authors using this. It's exactly actually what's in place for the EU ETS. You'll find that in Article 10B, I think, of the ETS directive. It's directly the formula, just in words. And then a question, or well, yeah, I guess it's a question. So typically, one would not maybe expect the Afolu sectors to be as high of a carbon risk as some of the other material sectors, at least they are not featured in existing carbon ETS systems, and I guess it's partly because they are not covered in the ETS systems, but then also it may be because they're only focusing mainly on CO2 emissions, and you included non-CO2 emissions, if I got this correct. So would this metric change potentially by quite some extent if you leave out the non-CO2 emissions?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So probably actually I haven't test the version without non-CO2 emissions. I then probably expect that carbon leakage risk is higher for materials, for energy intensive sectors. And yeah, we didn't do this in the paper, but yeah, it's a nice also thing to see the contribution of these different types of gases. Importantly, as you remember, I also said that the greenhouse gas emissions databases exclude land use change emissions, and if we include this kind of emissions, probably we are going to have an even higher carbon leakage risk in, for instance, agri-food sectors or photoplast sectors.
Thank you. We have a comment from Dileep, but Maksym, go ahead. Let's give you the floor.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. So I have one comment and one question. So on the land use emissions, FLU emissions, I think the complication there is how do you map those to sectors? So if it's like savanna burning, how do you allocate them to a specific sector? The activity itself might not be sector specific at all. So yeah, or like, wildfire, for instance. So that's a complication, and that's one of the reasons why in the non-CO2 database we report these emissions, but just in aggregate. So leaving researchers and kind of opportunity to distribute them in some way, or it's more important for the climate models to have a full accounting. So that's the main reason why those are included in the database. The question I have, and it's an observation. So I was looking into your graph with emission intensities. And I was somewhat surprised that petroleum and coal products have such a high emission intensity, much higher than the rest of the sectors, because essentially emissions are generated when petroleum or other fossil fuels are combusted. So kind of both direct and indirect emissions from the petroleum product production are, well, they are not very large, at least substantially lower than, let's say, iron and steel. And on the other hand, for electricity, I was surprised that the electricity emission intensity is relatively low, while in general, what we see in our estimates and from other studies, that electricity would have like probably the highest emission intensity because there is some share of gas and coal power generation mix, and that's usually just drives the results tremendously. So I was just wondering, can you comment on this, or did you compare it with other studies? Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your question. Yes, I agree with you that we have to check why this is the case. I mean, there are probably several reasons for these. Maybe the other studies have found different results because of the specific emission intensity formulas they use. And of course, this is also, I mean, these high values here also might be driven by high values in some countries actually, and this is also a thing. So depending on which country you are, this petroleum and crude and electricity average emission intensities will be different. But yeah, thanks for the remark. We will have to check this again, why it is the case.
Angela, before you, let me just quickly move in Dileep's note. Julio, Dileep notes a comparison between your direct plus indirect emissions with the Commission's language of scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. Can you make a note to the audience, the resemblance and the difference across the two definitions?
Sorry. Direct emissions in this work are scope 1 emissions. So they're happening inside of the establishment, so to say. And indirect emissions in our study are actually scope 2 and 3. So are both, because scope 2 are just like, if I'm not mistaken, the electricity emissions in the production inputs, and scope 3 are all the other inputs. And in this case, our indirect emissions cover all these two.
Thank you. Thank you for the note. Angelo?
Yes. Thank you, Julio, for the presentation. I think it was very interesting. My question is about your assumption of excluding intra-OECD trade, right? I'm not sure if I got why you exclude that. You mentioned some other paper, but would your results change if you didn't exclude that? And a second question is, what's the intuition about the relative high risk, leakage risk in the AFOLU sectors? It's because they are very intensive in CO2 emissions, or which part of your equation is driving that?
Thanks for your question, Angelo. So the first one is if the results will change if we change the intra. So if we allow for intra OECD trade, and the answer is I don't know. We haven't done this kind of sensitivity, but it's a good idea. And the intuition actually to exclude intra-OECD also calls for the kind of emission intensity and trade exposure indicators used by the European Union, where they exclude intra-EU trade. And the idea is that EU countries or OECD countries are expected, so to say, to have higher or more stringent climate policies in place. So if we have countries with a more similar carbon policy ambition and stringency, probably we won't expect that carbon leakage happens, or the source of carbon leakage are these OECD countries or European Union countries, but rather a country with much lower climate policy stringency. That's the idea.
And it makes sense inside the UE. The European Union, right? The EU, but it doesn't make sense to other countries outside European Union. So you can have countries like Mexico, Chile, or others that doesn't have that high ambition, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And then it's also a very interesting exercise to exclude these OECD members, which might not have stringent climate policies in place. Thanks for the comment. And regarding the second, why the AFOLU Plus have high carbon leakage risk, actually, well, first is this weight of non-CO2 emissions, which are not so small. And the second reason is actually that if you look at the formula of the emission intensity, it's divided by gross value added in the sector. So it might be that the value added in agricultural sectors is much smaller compared to the value added in other industrial sectors, and this is a reason why this emission intensity might be so high for these sectors.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Leo. One last clarification remark from Will Martin from IFPRI in the chat box. He wants you to clarify that whether your leakage estimates include leakage in export sectors as well as those in the import competing sectors that are the only ones covered under the EC scheme. Is that right? That's the comment.
So this probably has to do with the trade exposure indicator that we use in the paper, and actually this trade exposure, it's sort of trade openness, and it includes exports and import. So the carbon leakage risk should also capture that happening through or via export markets. That lies sort of the share of the carbon leakage risk happening at each side, like imports or exports, is something I cannot really say.
Well, okay. Thank you, Julio. And let's give a round of applause for the work, for all the labor committee, and also the participants from the audience. Thank you. Now we are going to move to our next presenter, Marc Vielle from EPFL University Lausanne. Dr. Vielle holds a PhD from University of Paris 1, that is Panthéon Sorbonne, and he'll be presenting on making the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism acceptable and climate friendly for least developed countries. Marc, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I will share my screen. Let me see if it works. And do you see my slides? Yes?
Yes, let's go ahead.
So I switch in presentation mode. I suppose it's okay. So thank you. So I am presenting a paper that was co-authored with my colleague Sigit Perdana, who is also working at EPFL. So we take as a departure the FIF455 and the CBAM tool that is supposed to be associated. So as you all know, the new climate policy package that is called EU FIF455 aim to increase the climate target to reach greenhouse gas emission reduction by 55% in 2030 with respect to 1990 level and to reach climate neutrality in 2050. Within this package, the Commission wants also to stop free allowance within the EU ETS. And in order to make this free allowance cancellation acceptable by firms, the European Commission proposed also to associate a CBAM economic instrument for sectors that are included in the EU ETS. So the aim of the CBAM is to address carbon leakage, but also, of course, to limit the competitiveness loss for European firms. As it is right now defined, the CBAM will be implemented through what we call carbon-based import tariff using, and we already discussed this point, using scope 1, which means direct emission. Right now, the sectors that are supposed to be included in this CBAM will be power sectors and some energy intensive industry. You have the list: cement, steel, aluminum, and fertilizer. And right now, we also addressed this point during the discussion. There is nothing that is supposed to be implemented for export. It's only for imports coming into EU. Based on this proposal, there is several concerns regarding the CBAM, especially coming by developing countries that say that this instrument could be quite detrimental and could have a high impact in terms of welfare because some LDCs countries export significantly to EU. So there have been several papers that raise this point and try to address this point, and that's mainly the aim of this paper, to see what can be done for these least developing countries. So what is the research background? We want to see how we can limit the negative impact of the CBAM on LDCs by using different instruments. The first one, of course, that was proposed especially by developing countries, simply to exempt the least developing country for the CBAM. But you have also other proposals that have been raised that, for example, has to do some compensation, income compensation to LDCs country an income compensation that can be based on the revenue coming from this CBAM. That's right now not the position of the European Commission, but anyway, we want to address, to see first if this CBAM is detrimental to LDC's country, and to see also how we can try to limit this welfare impact for these countries. So for doing this research, we are using a computable general equilibrium model that is called Gemini E3 model, which is based on the GTAP database. Right now, we are using a baseline that is supposed to include what we call current policies regarding climate change. And for example, for EU in the baseline, we assume the former EU targets. The time frame of our analysis 2020-2040. What we are doing, we with respect to this baseline, we move to the EU Fit for 55 target without and with CBAM, and we try to be as close as the European Commission proposal. So we assume the scope 1, and we look to 8 different scenarios trying to limit the cost for LDCs. So first of all, on the model itself, we use a worldwide version, and you can see here the countries or regions that are described. We have EU, of course, 28 regions, USA, China, Brazil, Russia, Middle East, rest of the world. And the last 4 countries or regions are the one that we call LDC's country. So this is a country or the region that we will have to look on the welfare in order to limit. So it's mainly India, Central and South America, rest of Asia, meaning without China and India, and Africa, of course. So first, here in this table, you have the impact of the Fit for 55 package without CBAM. So what is interesting is to look mainly to EU. You can see that, well, this, and it is for year 2040. This policy is costly. I mean, the cost is evaluated to 3.6% of GDP change for the year 2040. The welfare, it's a little higher. And as you can see, you have negative impact on, in the third column, on energy intensive production chain that is decreasing by close to 14%. And of course, we have some leakage rate that is equal to 70%. So we try to do some comparison to the results that have been published already by GRC, GME3, and some paper published by GTAP, and we have something similar. So this is without CBAM. Now we can run exactly the same scenario, but with CBAM. I mean, CBAM implemented for what we call energy intensive industry, that will group chemical, fertilizer, that will group also paper, steel, and so on. So we have only one energy intensive industry sectors. As you can see, when we, and it is now the Fit for 55 package, but with CBAM, when you implement the CBAM, that reduce the leakage rate, I mean, by 1/3, which is not so high, but it is mainly because we are only using scope 1. And of course, when we run the same scenario with scope 2, I mean, the leakage rate, it's much more, decrease much more. But anyway, we are using scope 1. You can see that the impact of energy intensive industry is not so high. You decrease the output loss, but I mean, the decrease is not so high by something 2 points. But you increase, of course, European welfare, but you have this detrimental impact on this 4 LDCs region because the welfare is increasing, the welfare loss is increasing for this welfare by $37 billion. So now the aim will be to try to see what we can be done in order to limit this welfare impact on LDCs. We will look to 4 main indicators. Of course, CO2 leakage, which is in black in this graph. We will look to the welfare of LDC, and we wish to increase the welfare of LDCs. And of course, we will have to look to the cost for EU, which is the blue bar. And we also want to see what is the impact on the competitiveness of energy-intensive industries. First idea was to simply make some exemption, something that is already implemented for some tariff at EU level for LDCs. So we do not implement the CBAM on LDCs, and you can see that it has some positive welfare on LDCs, the green bar, but this has a quite negative impact on competitiveness or leakage. So something probably that we don't have to go, and the main reason is because you do not have the price incentive on imports coming from LDCs. The second option is to use the revenue collected for CBAM and to make some redistribution to LDCs. We have two scenarios. The first one is to assume that we collect all the CBAM revenue, not only the one coming from LDCs, but the one coming from US and so on, and we redistribute this CBAM revenue through a per capita rule only to LDCs. And the second option that is probably more realistic to say, okay, the revenue coming from India will be redirected to India. I mean, the revenue, the CBAM revenue collected from India export will be redistributed to India. First scenario, probably unrealistic, but you can see that you keep the price incentive on the CBAM, so you don't have this negative impact on CO2 leakage. It's quite welfare improving from LDC because you redistribute more than the contribution to the LDCs, but it's also quite costly for EU, and this has some detrimental impact on energy-intensive industries. The second option is more or less the same, but as the revenue redistributed to CBAM is less large, you have the same impact, but with less order of magnitude, which is probably also welfare improving for LDCs, less costly for EU, and on the leakage, we have some small negative impact. We look to other option because we were not really happy on the impact in terms of welfare and CO2. So the other scenario that we try to run is when we assume that you will not do lump sum transfer, I mean income redistribution that is supposed to do here in this case. We suppose that we give the revenue to government that redistribute itself to household. Here what we assume is that the EU will increase the saving, and by doing such a thing, increase investment in LDCs. So without targeting any sectors nor technology. And here and in the following one, we will always use the revenue coming from the LDC itself to do this redistribution scheme. As you can see, well, there is not a big difference with respect to the former scenario. Welfare improving, cost is not increasing, of course, because you redistribute more or less the same amount of money, and you have some increase of CO2 leakage coming from the GDP increase in these LDCs, but there is not a big difference with respect to the previous scenario. We tried two other scenarios when we implement the subsidies on investment in this case. So the revenue is used to put subsidies on investment in LDCs. First scenario, to energy-intensive industry. So the idea was to say, okay, we will try to facilitate the decarbonization of energy-intensive industry in LDCs using the CBAM revenue. Or we can go in another direction, saying that, okay, maybe, energy-intensive industry is not a good way to make the development in LDC. Maybe we can try to facilitate the diversification. So we invest in non-energy intensive sectors. As you can see in the first case, when you when you put subsidies in energy-intensive industry in LDCs, the welfare is improving a little more than the former scenario. You increase CO2 leakage because mostly the production in this country is increasing. So, which increase pollution from this energy-intensive industry. And the cost is more or less equal to the first one. So the second scenario, related to investment subsidies, are less positive impact, but with regard to CO2 leakage, because you are promoting diversification, you decrease CO2 leakage, you decrease CO2 emission in LDCs, and probably you limit the loss of competitiveness for energy intensive industry in EU. But one difficulty that we have is that we are subsidizing total investment, and because we don't have, for example, in our model, different type of investment that could be, investment dedicated to energy consumption, that would be probably the most better, the better way to do this subsidy. We don't have this different type of investment, but probably the model is not well designed to do such a scenario. Finally, the last, one of the last scenario is when we implement subsidies not on this investment in these sectors, but when we implement subsidies in electricity generation in renewable. And you can see that, well, in terms of CO2, the impact is quite large. Why? Because in this scenario, you decrease power plants with coal and natural gas, and you increase power generation with wind and solar, and you are the impact here. You increase renewable by something like 240 terawatt-hours in LDCs. So that has a big impact on terms of CO2. You decrease emission in these countries. In terms of welfare, is it also welfare improving for the LDCs? The cost is not so high for EU. And in terms of CO2 leakage, in terms of increase of energy intensive industries, production is not so high. So probably the best solution. And the last scenario that we try to analyze is we try to say, okay, maybe we can try to limit energy poverty in LDCs. So we look to some database and do some back envelope computation. We find using some database, specific database on technology that, doing 1% efficiency improvement in electric appliance. It could be a refrigerator, dishwasher, or of some other appliance using by household. Usually, when you want to improve energy efficiency by 1%, it costs more or less $1 to $4 based on this database. So we assume we will invest that 1% efficiency improvement is more or less $3, and we do some back envelope computation. We say, okay, try to replace existing refrigerators. We take a typical one, and we allocate to each household $100, and with this $100, they can switch to a more efficient refrigerators. And using this analysis, you can see that based on this back envelope computation, we can compute what will be the impact in terms of electricity consumption decrease. We implement this assumption in our model, and we have this last impact is that when we finance electric appliance, you see that which is something that is interesting, we achieve more or less the same decrease of CO2 in LDC's country, but the welfare improvement is much more higher. For household, it's a huge welfare improvement. The cost for LDC, for EU, it's also close to the former one, and the impact on energy intensive industry is not so high. So probably the two last scenario are the best option to do this redistribution. So conclusion, first of all, based on the EU proposal, the Sebnem is not very effective to reducing leakage and to limit competitiveness. As I said, mainly because you are only using scope 1, and we do the test when you use scope 2, the impact in terms of competitiveness and in terms of leakage is much more higher. The other reason is, of course, because nothing is right now defined for export. So there is a loss, a high decrease of export in energy intensive industry coming from EU. The Sebnem is, of course, what we find also, it's of course detrimental to LDC, not only to LDC, but also that that is the point of the paper, also to other countries. But it is detrimental to LDCs, and third, leading to significant welfare costs, which is something probably problematic because we don't understand why this country has to suffer higher costs based on this EU proposal. Exemption, which has been raised several times, it's probably not a good idea because it results in higher leakage to other complementary scenarios. So probably the best solution is to use the money coming from this CBAM on LDC's export, to use this revenue to promote clean energy or to improve energy efficiency in these LDCs. And by doing that, you can improve, you can decrease greenhouse gas emission, and you can improve welfare in LDCs. Of course, there is a cost, but I think this cost is manageable by European Union. So that's it.
Thank you, Marc, for provoking us. And we have 2 hands already. Now it's 3. Now we'll start with Will Martin from IFPRI. Please go ahead. Will, we cannot see you, and you are.
Yep. Okay.
Yes,
great. Thank you very much, and thanks, Marc, for a very interesting presentation. I note that at the beginning you mentioned that the European proposal doesn't include export rebates. It's asymmetric. It's a trade barrier rather than a shift, what could be a very efficient shift from taxing production, which is highly mobile, especially in our models, to taxing consumption. I have a new EUI paper out making that point. If you're going to tax part of production or consumption, you're likely to get less leakage if you make it a complete CBAM, including exports, because you're taxing the part of the inelastic side of the market. So that's one point. The other point on the welfare loss to developing countries, this was explored by Aditya Mattu and Arvind Subramani and Dominic van der Bensbrugge a few years back. And they find that if you add an export rebate, this problem of loss to developing countries is vastly diminished. I mean, when you think about it at the moment, developing countries that are not participating are going to see their export opportunities sharply curtailed, and they get no benefit on their import side. Whereas if you add in an export rebate, you take away that loss on the you take away a loss for them. So and that's been modeled and found. So I guess my question is, when answering this question, why not include an export rebate and make it a full CBAM, full border adjustment, not just a partial only imports adjustment? Thank you.
So I'm not sure to follow exactly what you mean. Okay. So you mean export rebate on EU export? I mean, within in EU.
Correct. That you would expect that to help, and Aditya and others point out that it does help developing countries a great deal if you add that. It also should reduce leakage. I mean, my EUI paper makes that point, just with some simple illustrative modeling. So that's why I just wonder why you didn't consider the export rebate.
Yeah, I mean, we can simulate export rebate. We did it, but the point is that we try to follow the European Commission proposal, which does not include right now export rebate. What I understand from further discussion is that export rebate is quite problematic with respect to World Trade Organization, and probably that export rebate will not pass. I'm not a lawyer, but what I understand from a lawyer is that probably export rebate will not be pass the World Trade Organization rules. So it's and that as it is defined CBAM right now, could pass the World Trade Organization rule. So my answer will be, we can consider export rebate, of course. We do it in the past, but as we want to follow the exact definition of the European Commission proposal, we didn't include it.
But export rebates are part of a VAT, and they're allowed. So I doubt that the WTO.
Well, thank you for the discussion. And now, in order to conserve on time, we have been accumulating hands. I will give the floor Antoine and then direct it to Wu Sheng in that order, and ask Marc to answer those two questions in a row. Antoine, please go ahead, sir.
Do you hear me?
We do.
Okay, good. First, I would like to congratulate Marc. It was really a very, very interesting paper. So I'm going to read it this evening. I was surprised by, not that surprised by, the loss of welfare in EU in the Fit for 55 package without CBAM. And in fact, with CBAM, I think it's very relatively close. It's 4.2, minus 4.2. So I would like to know if it is, if it corresponds to other evaluations. So, or you are an outlier in terms of the literature estimating that first. Second, I'm a little bit surprised. I do not exactly understand what happens in Russia, because the welfare is decreasing and the GDP is increasing in this scenario. So do you have an explanation of that? And last, your very interesting last two scenarios. You increase energy efficiency in least developed countries with the money coming from the CBAM revenue. That's correct?
Yes.
So what happens? It means that you force the consumption of households in order to make them buy more efficient, energy efficient goods, and at the same time, so it means that they emit less carbon, and at the same time you increase their welfare. Is it a little bit redundant? Yeah, I do not see exactly what you do with this money.
Okay, thank you. And Wu Sheng,
congratulations again.
Thank you. Wu Sheng, maybe we can take your question as well and ask Marc to answer both.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I have two quick questions. The first one regarding also your Fit for 55 scenario and the results. There, it seems to me that you have a very modest carbon leakage of 17%, but the production losses seems to be quite substantial at 13 or 14%. So you compare that to some other studies, and but it seems to me if these results stand, then carbon leakage wouldn't actually be a very big concern to begin with. So that's and then looking at the same table, I saw that you have the number for China as the largest exporter of nearly everything. The EU's climate policy seems to reducing the Chinese IATA productions. There was a small reduction here, whereas competitors such as the USA is actually benefiting from the EU climate policy. So I was a bit curious about those results. And then lastly, it's a very minor comment, and you have the developing world aggregated into several rather large groups, and then there I find the definition of LDC to be somewhat unclear, because on the UN's list there are 46 of them, and most of these countries are not necessarily major producers and exporters of the products currently on the EU's CBAM list. So this is just a comment there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So on the first question on the cost of the EU, I mean the new EU climate policy package, that's true that it's quite. I mean the cost is significant, but we are looking to year 2040, so we are not close to. I don't remember the numbers, but we are close to 80% reduction, something like that, which begin to be significant. So I will say that if I compare to other studies, probably we are quite higher cost than the others, especially if you compare to bottom-up model, but difficult to say more. Probably, maybe you can say that some technology are not represented in the model that maybe will allow to reduce the cost, but that's true that in 2040, the cost is something 4%. If I remember, if you are going to full decarbonization, but within a global level, I mean, at a global level, the cost is close to 6% of welfare loss. So, okay, that's significant, probably at the higher top of evaluation, difficult to say more. Russia, indeed, I was also surprised. Russia, the GDP is increasing and the welfare is decreasing. Always the same issue that, I mean, I'm not sure that the GDP, I mean, it's what we usually say that the right indicator is welfare change and not GDP. Welfare change, I understand greatly that the change is coming mainly from loss of energy export that are decreasing from EU, I mean, and also from decrease in, and there is in the same time an increase in energy intensive production. So I don't know, I mean, it's mainly coming from term of trade effects. I suspect the exchange rate, but that's true, that was surprise also me. On the way we implement I don't know if it is a clear answer, but on the way we implement the last scenario, what we assume is that, in fact, all it is technically represented, we implement technical progress in household energy consumption in residential purpose based on this ex-ante impact. So you have some technical progress that will limit energy consumption, positive technical progress on energy, but we assume in the same time, because you have to invest more, I mean, you have to buy a more expensive refrigerator, we implement also positive, in this case, I mean, negative technical progress on other consumption goods for households. So they have to buy more material, more refrigerator. So there is a negative technical progress and a positive on energy. And for this additional expenditure that they have to do, it is funded by European Commission. So they will receive the money directly. They do not increase, they do not allocate more income to this additional expenditure, if I can say. It is how it's technically represented. Coming from Vusheng's remark, so leakage. That's true that the leakage is not so high. Difficult to say more. I mean, what I understand, if I look, for example, to a paper done by Kirion, he tried to do a survey on leakage range. I think we are on the range, not at the higher range, but I don't know what to say. Indeed, the leakage rate is not so high, but it is significant anyway. Chinese, that's true that something strange, also that surprised me, that Chinese energy intensive production, it is not increasing a lot. And in contrary, USA is increasing. I mean, you have to look to the exchange matrix. I don't remember what is the exact explanation. I think there is also some, but I'm not sure. I need to check some issue related to the exchange rate. But I saw something that was strange also for me. Sorry, Vusheng, I have to go back to the paper, I mean, to the result to have a more clear explanation. Sorry for that.
Okay, thank you so much, Marc. We have a quick comment from Jean. I will just take the comment and close the presentation. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Marc, for this very interesting presentation. My comment is more follow-up on Wushan questions on leakage rate, because the results you found, Marc, are completely consistent with those that I found and I found in the literature review. So very low leakage rate and very low decrease in leakage from CBAM. And this, you provide an explanation through indirect emissions, which is, I think, one explanation, but I wanted to contribute another one, which was the main one I identified in my own paper, which was the fact that carbon leakage does not come from competitiveness a lot. It's more of a global energy market issue, which means that if you implement a CBAM, you only correct the competitiveness part, which is quite short. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I agree. I mean, there is two channels. I mean, one that is related to world energy market that drive part of the leakage, of course. Yes.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the very lively discussion. Thank you so much, Marc. And I invite the floor to congratulate Professor Vielle with a round of applause, please. And in the meantime, Marc, please unshare your screen so that we can move along with
sorry for that.
Dileep Birur. Our next presenter is Dileep from Economic and Valuation Services, KPMG, United States. Dr. Birur holds a PhD from Purdue University, and he will be presenting us today on fostering green economy in New Jersey under the aegis of Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Dileep, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Erinc. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks for making it to the presentation. Thanks for the organizers. Today I will be presenting about fostering green economy in New Jersey, a state in the US under the aegis of RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. This is a study done with colleagues from Montclair State University in New Jersey and Argonne National Laboratory. This was the study was funded by New Jersey Bureau of Public Utilities. So just to give some background about RGGI is one of the first cap and trade program in the US. It started in 2009. There were like 11 or 12 states which were participant. And the idea was that RGGI, it brings it introduces the CO2 emissions cap, and then it auctions these CO2 allowances, and the proceeds are distributed for individual states for investments in clean energy, energy infrastructure, and other GHG mitigation policies. So the New Jersey, it was a founding member from 2009, and due to some political reasons, it exited in 2011. And then it rejoined in 2020. So when it rejoined, so there was some discussion because this is the regional RGGI, it just caps only the emissions from power generation, electricity generation. So there will be some kind of generation shift or leakage would be happening, because some states which are part of the same grid and other states which are also showing on the map, this entire Eastern Interconnect is as a group of states which are, some are subjected under RGGI, they are RGGI members, and some are non-RGGI members. So the non-RGGI members who are not subjected for cap and trade or capping their emissions, so they would find some cheaper electricity. So, and also they could increase the emissions. So that's the shift in electricity generation. If there is a power plant located in one of these states, so they could shift their generation source to another state. So that was the concern. Because of that, the NJBPO commissioned this study to estimate what is the size of the potential size of this leakage, and what are the economic impacts in terms of whether the energy becomes more expensive, or how it contributes to economic growth and employment in the state. Basically, here we use two models. One is Aurora model. It's a bottom-up dispatch model. Basically, it's a very detailed electricity generation power system model. It gives a hourly generation of electricity by various sources of electricity generation. And the other model is CG model, which is based on GTAP, GTAP and then GTAP power. So which are combined along with, we use the database which explicitly splits all these states and New Jersey and then rest of other REGI regions and then rest of the US and rest of the PJM market, which is the electricity grid market in this region. So that's the database component, and we use the same regular GTAP power databases and the electricity generation emissions, and that which is the standard structure of the GTAP power and then GN model features. And the way we interlink these two models is this. First, we run the electricity dispatch model with the same reference case, which has reference case a bunch of assumptions on what are the some of the policies such as renewable portfolio standard or energy efficiency or solar. There is a huge offshore wind generation programs going on for the coming decade. So all these energy transition plans are introduced into these reference case, and when these are, along with some counterfactual scenarios, when these are simulated into the Aurora model, we generate the CO2 emissions resulting from this dispatch model, and they are introduced into the CG model so that we have some consistency in the CO2 emissions. And yes, allowance prices are also exogenous here. That's because these are set by the REGI auction program. So there is a projection for what would be the alliance prices in the coming decade. So we use those as the exogenous prices, and we simulate the CG model for generating the economy-wide impacts. So if we look at the regional disaggregation, so this is the model basically consists of 5 explicit regions, aggregated regions. So the REGI states constitutes 9 group of states, apart from New Jersey, it's a tiny state from navy blue. And then other 11 states is the rest of the PJM market. That's where the leakage is potentially, we are going to estimate, and what are the impacts of this. And all other states are grouped as rest of USA and then rest of the world. So there's a standard aggregation of sectors, basically covering mostly disaggregated electricity sectors. That's the focus of this study. So the scenarios, we have one reference scenario, which is called a mid CO2 prices, mid CO2 allowance price, which is the blue line. So the CO2 allowance prices, there is a projection, historical and modeled based on REGI determines what would be the CO2 allowance prices for the next decade. We use that one as the reference case. And there are a whole bunch of other policies which also form the reference case assumption is the renewable portfolio standard, energy efficiency assumptions. What would be the natural gas consumption in energy efficiency in natural gas consumption, and then behind the meter solar generation capacity added every single year, and then new battery storage capacity that's also being planned, but it was implemented only in the Aurora model, not in the CG model. Of course, the offshore wind, which is a major energy transition plan here. So those are some of the major reference case assumptions. Other CO2 allowance prices for something called high cost containment results, which is a high allowance price. That's the trigger price. And then our counterfactual was low allowance price. With these 3 prices, the main difference is the allowance prices. There were 3 additional sensitivity scenarios we did, which is the high natural gas prices and then low natural gas prices based on Henry Hub natural gas projections. From Energy Information Administrations. And then there is what if there is a high PJM demand, when there is high electricity demand in this region, what happens to these impacts? So that's another scenario we examined here. Some of the key assumptions under different scenarios here, just to distinguish like how different they are. So some of the allowance prices are the differences between a couple of scenarios here, and then natural gas prices differences are here, high and low. And then PGM peak load, how much was the megawatt assumption was made versus the regular load versus the peak load. And if there is a natural gas price is reducing by 10%, or what are the scenarios we assume? So the reference case assumptions, which I just highlighted, these are done year-wise. There's some intermittent years. The renewable portfolio standard, it ramps up. It's not linear, so it has some stepwise type of introduction. For example, in 2021, so 22% of the electricity generated in this state has to come from renewable sources, but by 2030, it has to reach to 50%. And then by 2050, they have something like 80%. So same way, different assumptions for different years. And these are the results from the dispatch model, basically. So what is the relative change in power generation when New Jersey joins a regional greenhouse gas initiative? So as you see, the first is the main relative generation from natural gas-based generation drops huge, and then other states in the same electricity grid picks up, mostly Pennsylvania, and then Maryland and New York regions are the ones which show up high, and that's mostly coming from natural gas and some other generations. So here is the bottom graph is the annual generation changes in New Jersey when it joins the RGGI in the reference case. These are the CO2 emissions from electricity generation. So the CO2 emissions sharply decline through 2030 when NJ participates. When NJ does not participate, it's not a big state. It's not a big emissions. It's only 19 million metric tons of CO2 emissions. But when it joins from it drops to almost about half of it. So these because most of the generation comes from natural gas, so it's all the reductions are attributed to natural gas reduction generations. So this is the change in CO2 emissions and energy mix in Eastern Interconnect. Eastern Interconnect is a broader one, broader grid. So approximately about 0.5 to 2 metric tons annually from 2020 to 2030 increase we see, and the emissions are increasing by 0.2% by 2030. And this one is relative generation. This is the increase in Eastern Interconnect emissions is mainly coming from the coal generation, so which is mostly in the Pennsylvania region. So this is one of the key takeaway from the study is the relative and annual cumulative versus the cumulative emissions, which is the leakage component. So annual wise, the leakage is very small when New Jersey joins RGGI, the white component. So it starts very small and then it's up to 2 million metric tons of CO2. But the cumulative change in the reference case is like 17 million metric tons. So leakage is greater greater than the reference when the allowance price is high. So allowance price is the one which matters the most. So it is smaller where the allowance prices than the reference case. These are the smaller leakages than the reference case. When allowance price is lower and natural gas price is lower, and they have other scenarios and minimal impact compared to the high allowance prices. The energy prices from the dispatch model, so they increase marginally. The gap between these two types of prices, they remain less than 5%, so not a big substantial change in the electricity prices from the dispatch model. And using those results, now bringing back to the CG model, so we have RGGI proceeds. Along with those assumptions, we also introduce the RGGI proceeds in New Jersey when the state joins regional RGGI. So RGGI proceeds, they are calculated by the state. So given the current allowance prices, what would be the RGGI proceeds and how they are going to allocate it across different activities. One is to develop this EV infrastructure, how much is different, like for 30% there and 40% in energy efficiency and assistance programs, energy assistance programs, and then some small fraction for conservation and forestry programs. So we introduced as in additional shocks in the CG model. So as a result, this is the annual gross GSP. It's a state GDP changes from the reference case. As you notice, it's a small marginal increase, steady increase in GDP we notice for the New Jersey, it's gross state product. And all other regions also see some in the reference case because all the renewable portfolio standards and everything is introduced here in the baseline. So those are also keep increasing. The difference between across the scenarios, annual change is the real GSP. It expands more significantly after 2024 in most of the cases, because that's when all the RGGI proceeds are increased and then they are introduced more aggressively into the state economy. As a result, the GDP naturally picks up in most of the cases. Only the difference is because of the allowance prices difference. And cumulatively in 2030, the real GSP, we can say roughly estimate increases by about $2.3 trillion in the state. Similarly, the cumulative change in employment, if you look at, so the employment, it's about 7,600 jobs are added by 2030. And most of these jobs come from the state, the sectors which are directly related to wind power generation and also solar electricity, some transportation sector and construction activities, maybe multiplier effect of the green economy. And these are the differences in employment generation across all the 6 scenarios here. So highest job growth is somewhere we noticed in the higher natural gas price scenario, relatively expensive because the gas-based generation, when it replaces it, also helps in other renewables. So probably that's the reason why we noticed a little higher job growth in those sectors. Mostly these changes are directly coming from the energy-related sectors and the construction sectors. The price-wise, the impact on prices, when we look at from the CG model, there is a very small change in the, when we translate that percentage change into cents per kilowatt hour from the CG model. So the price change is very marginal. But in terms of magnitude, but intuitively, directionally, they're intuitive. New Jersey and RGGI regions, the prices are positive changes, and then slightly the declining prices as we noticed because of the leakage in rest of PJM and rest of US markets. This is the summary of economy-wide impact. If you have to summarize in a nutshell across all the 6 scenarios, what is the percentage change in gross state product across these 6 scenarios is the highest we noticed in the low natural gas prices in the New Jersey, high CO2 prices, CO2 alliance prices, followed by low natural gas prices. And in terms of billions of dollars, it's about 5.29 billions of dollars change. Employment changes are also very small, but number of jobs added, it translates into these 7,000 to 8,000 jobs, and GSP multiplier, because multiplier is calculated based on the RGGI proceeds investments made into the economy. So the key takeaways is, NJ, when it joins the RGGI, of course, it substantially reduces the CO2 emissions from the electricity generation sector, and they are contributing to the economic growth in the state because of the RGGI proceeds mainly coming from those revenues. And overall net reduction in New Jersey is met by net higher generation in number of nearby states when the electricity generation in the state goes down, so it's supplied by the neighboring states. And the cost of RGGI allowances changes, and the cost of energy production in New Jersey, they have a very marginal impact, but their impacts are highly sensitive to these CO2 alliance prices. The multipliers, what we calculated, they also show how they are very directly related to the investments and from the RGGI proceeds. So trading carbon dioxide is the carbon in not only reduces the emissions in nutshell, but also generated the auction proceeds and helped boost the investments in the green energy infrastructure and generated employment, and ultimately benefited the overall economy. Some of the caveats of this study, if I have to highlight, so of course, there were a few other states which recently joined, like Virginia. We haven't modeled that state. Maybe we'll have a little more difference in leakages when we accommodate that kind of changes. And also the transportation is another major sector, which is a substantial contributor to CO2 emissions in the state. So, which is not considered for any leakage type of analysis because it was explicitly for the electricity generation point of view. So those are some of the key takeaways. And then, of course, there are many mitigation options we can examine here, like various other policies like carbon tax and increased RGGI participation. They're coming from like bringing in more states into this RGGI umbrella will also result in reduced leakages, further reducing leakages. So those are some of the studies we could probably be done. So with that, I'll stop. So thanks for listening. I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Dileep. Thanks. The floor is open for questions, and we are going to start with Sebnem.
Hello, Dileep. Excellent presentation, very down to earth for me. This is my lack of knowledge, and it relates to what we discussed yesterday in the green jobs, the role of the, let's say, public and how much the public is relevant for US, you will tell us. But let's say RGGI is kind of a regulator in terms of, green agenda. They are fixing their allowance prices versus the private producers of energy. So my first question about how does the RGGI determine allowance price for CO2? Is it a market mechanism or spirit, or there's a social, thinking behind it? One question. And you showed this renewables importance also in transportation. So are you taking into account switching to electric vehicles and starting with the buses and so on used by the administration plus the private users? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Sebnem. Very good questions. So RGGI allowance, it's some very small linear trend they've used as 5% or 2.5% annual increase. So it's a very linear, if you have seen those graphs. So it's a linear estimations of the allowance prices. So there is a huge debate on how these allowance prices were determined. So those were like some of the the states were hesitant. So there were stakeholders on either side. Oh, these are too high prices or too low prices. But when in 2020, 2019, in this debate was very hard. And then that time the allowance prices were very low and the RGGI, much higher. Actual market prices were very low. When New Jersey joined, coincidentally or something, the allowance prices started moving along with the RGGI market auction prices. So they're on par. They even exceeded now if you look at the market actual prices. So which is a good sign. At least it's moving in that direction. But these are linear projections which RGGI makes. And then maybe with the historic, these are auctioned once in 3 or 4 every quarter. Probably with the more historical data, they can adjust these prices in the future depending on the stakeholders' needs. And the second question is about the infrastructure, right? Because state is also moving towards this electric vehicles infrastructure. So there is a major thrust for investing in aggressively into these EV charging stations and EV infrastructure. So 90% of the proceeds are allocated for these infrastructure for the next 2 years, I think. And then eventually it will go into conservation programs, energy assistance programs like that.
Many thanks, Dileep. There is a question in the chat box from Julio. While you are looking at it, let me read it aloud, summarize for you. He refers to a recent paper by Fournier and others, 2021, where it shows that leakage might be considerable in California's electricity market. And this is mainly due to emission resource reshuffling. and he would like to concur whether you are aware of the paper, and if so, how would your results concur with their findings?
Yes, thank you for this question. Yes, if you look at the electricity grid market, California is more independent than these states. This Eastern Interconnect constitutes many states here. So, and these are smaller states, obviously. And then there are like Pennsylvania and then Virginia, West Virginia. These are the states which are coal rich. So there is substantial differences, especially in New York or New Jersey areas where we have to face higher electricity prices, though they are connected to the same grid. And that's where these states are aggressively going for the renewable electricity. And they're introducing all these state legislations to go for a greater level of renewable electricity generation. Whereas the other states within the same grid, they are more coal-based states. So they have to care about their jobs and other things. So they're not aggressively pushing for it. So because of this, the leakage component has always been a hot topic here. And here the leakage, I mean, from a New Jersey perspective, they were saying, okay, there will not be any leakage at all. So that was one part of the argument. But we also found that cumulatively there is small leakage, but otherwise the annual leakages are pretty small. Because the electricity generation is supplied, because other states are also going with this renewable electricity generation. So pretty much because of the transition in towards greener economy in other states as well now, so the leakage component is reducing.
Thanks.
Thanks, Dileep. Julio, would you like to make a recomment, a follow-up?
No, I think I'm fine. Thanks for the answer.
All right. Many thanks to both of you. Any further questions? Anything you would like to add from the floor? Well, folks, we are coming slowly towards the end of our session. Now, at this time, I would like to invite our participants or the presenters for any last-minute observations, additions. And in the meantime, I would like to thank Sebnem Sahin on everyone's behalf for bringing us all together. Any additions to the floor? Any last-minute comments, suggestions? Well, then I would like to take this opportunity to thank you all for your wonderful presentations, questions, very lovely, lively audience. And I am going to wrap up the presentation and the session on can carbon leakage hinder transition to a green economy. Great job. Thank you, Sebnem, again for bringing us together. Thank you, presenters, participants, and thank you, Maksym, for holding us all together in line with discipline. Thank you all. So long, friends.